Hey guys, welcome back. So now jumping right back into Symbiote Spider-Man. And I mean, we jumping right back in. And really just because it's just a good story. And even though it's like your retelling of the Black Suit Saga, it's still very entertaining because things don't play out exactly the way they did back when we had first seen Peter Parker return from Secret Wars, when he had first picked up the symbiote from Battle World. So let's jump right back in. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right back in and just getting right to it. And so with Mysterio, who had recently hired Hard Rock, who was like this unknown mutant that he picked up off the street, and he made him a costume that was impervious to Spider-Man's webbing, and he was just like, man, I need you to get rid of Spider-Man, and this no-name dude nearly did. But as you guys already know, that didn't end too well for Hard Rock, which is pretty much why none of us ever heard of him, which is something I really like. And just hear me out. See, here's the thing. Like, we're going back and telling a story like this, which is about the amazing Spider-Man, the spectacular Spider-Man, who can spin a web any size, punch the Hulk into space, you name it. I feel like some of the best parts is like when you throw in a moment where Peter Parker can actually look you in the eye and tell you, hey, I almost got beat to death by a dude you never heard of. Like, this guy's accomplished nothing, but he almost killed me. And to me, that's just one of the best things that you could just throw in the middle of events that we've heard of before. But either way, with Mysterio, who had just seen Hard Rock gruesomely killed, which as I mentioned made him throw open his helmet, immediately after he had to leave Wilson Fisk's office, with Fisk noticing that the door was locked for whatever reason and him had to barge his way in. And what this did is it raised his suspicion. And so as we know from Mysterio, who made his way to the roof, which is where he met with Jonathan Owen, and at this point in time I'm not even 100% sure if Quentin had the time to clean the vomit out of the helmet just yet, who knows. But at this point in time with him meeting with Jonathan on the roof, and for Jonathan Owen, who was not expecting Quentin, he just happened to come out and see him there. But it's here where Quentin Beck tells Jonathan that he wants to get a piece of this new costume that Spider-Man has, because just recently he's seen how powerful it can be. And so now not long after this conversation, we go back to Jonathan's office, and in his office, Kingpin just barges in because he hears Jonathan speaking with someone and he demands to know who it is. And of course Jonathan's just like, man, I'm just thinking out loud. There's nobody else here, just that empty chair across from me. Like, he just tells him that he was talking to himself and that was it. And Fisk, looking around, sees no one else there, sees the empty chair, and he's just like, okay, whatever, and he leaves. But of course, as we know, Quentin Beck was there the whole time. But it's here where Quentin expresses that the suit is super advanced. Spider-Man was clearly unconscious, and this suit made a decision, and a very specific one, on how to kill Hard Rock. But it's pretty clear that Mysterio does not have a chance at taking that suit from Spider-Man. But with talking to Jonathan, they are aware that Spider-Man does have a love interest, which is Black Cat, to whom they also know to be Felicia Hardy. And they figure if they can get to her, then they can get to him. And so now just real quick, the way that they even know Felicia Hardy's identity, that more so works into Jonathan working for Wilson Fisk, to whom at one point the Black Cat also worked for as well. But we'll get into more on that in a little bit. But for now, jumping back over to Spider-Man, who's facing off with Electro. And trust me, this fight looks way better than Spider-Man 2. But when he's facing off with Electro at this concert, to where the people at the concert think it's part of the show, oh man, that's just like Spider-Man 2. That's crazy. But with them facing off here, this is another one of those fights that doesn't go too long, with Peter pretty quickly figuring out a way to stop Electro, and doing so with one chasing him away from the crowd. And once doing so, he catches the guy's lighter, who was startled by all the commotion, and Peter uses it to activate the sprinklers in order to stop Electro. And in hindsight, this may have been that moment where Electro was arrested and he was in jail just thinking, man, I gotta make my suit waterproof, because this could have went just as bad had it been a rainy night. But not long after this, Peter is met by Felicia Hardy, who meets up with Peter sitting on the rooftop as he's just watching Electro get hauled away. But while they're here, she quickly gets into the conversation, immediately addressing Peter ditching her at Uncle Ben's gravesite, because for her, one, that was super awkward, but when it did happen, she did get the opportunity to talk to Aunt May. And Aunt May more or less put it together that she was Peter's girlfriend, and she told Felicia, well, you know, Peter listens to you, so perhaps you can talk him into doing something good with himself, getting back into school or something of that nature. Because of course Aunt May has her concerns for Peter, and she's not necessarily sure everything that's going on with him, but also at this point in time she does not know that he's Spider-Man. And Felicia just mainly trying to tell Peter she wished she had someone like Aunt May in her life, and she feels like what Peter really needs to do is just tell her that he's Spider-Man. To which Peter's like, psh, No, Aunt May's heart is being held together with like some duct tape and some hair clips. Like Peter's well aware that if he tells her, it would just destroy her. But this really just ignites an argument that stems from Peter just not doing what his girl told him to do, which is pretty much where relationship arguments stem from, at least in my experience. But of course, when the argument escalates, Peter just leaves, which is pretty much what a man should do if your girl ain't listening. And I mean like walk away, cool down, and talk about it later, and not so much to jump off a building and shoot webs part. But after this argument, Felicia goes back to her apartment, and it's here that she's met by Mysterio. And so now with her arriving here and Mysterio having been here, and Felicia really being well aware that Mysterio is more of your Spider-Man villain, so it's much more likely that he's come here in order to kidnap Felicia in order to get the attention of Spider-Man, or at least that's her assumption, because that's like supervillain day one, that's what they do. Like if there's a supervillain class anywhere, that's like your first homework assignment. But as it turns out, she comes to find out that that's not necessarily his plan, but rather he's here to hire Felicia for a job, because Mysterio tells Felicia that he actually wants her to take a sample of Peter's new suit and bring it back to him, and she'll be paid generously. And of course she tells him no, but even with doing so, Mysterio has his contingencies to where he resorts to plan B. And so it's here where Mysterio tells Felicia that if she doesn't bring him a sample of Spider-Man's new suit, then he will give Spider-Man a full case file about her history with Kingpin, which is something that she does not want him to know anything about. In addition to the details of her origin and her history, she was a straight up criminal. She was a cat burglar, and her history of becoming a burglar very much stems from her relationship with her father, who was also a burglar, and she spent half of her life hating him and the other half trying to be just like him. And it wasn't long after that we found out that her father, Walter Hardy, to whom her mother had told that he had died, but after finding out he was still alive, she had broke her father out of prison, and it was then that she had explained to him that the more she had learned about him, the more she had wanted to be like him, and she had modeled herself after him, in doing so with learning martial arts, gymnastics, in order to be like her father, Walter Hardy, to whom at one point was the best burglar in the world. But for Black Cat, after meeting Spider-Man and then growing closer to him, and Peter really being like the first man that she met that she felt like she can grow and trust, she eventually fell in love with him, and then after some time, she would begin to help him out, sort of like your anti-hero. But she also noticed that most of the time when she would try to help Spider-Man, whether it was versus Doc Ock or Hobgoblin or whoever, she would notice that in many cases, she would either nearly get killed, she would be in the way, or Spider-Man would just end up taking more hits than he would have had he been doing it on his own. And so it was for this reason that she ended up making a deal with Kingpin after nearly getting Peter killed again, and this caused her to seek out a way to become stronger and faster so that she could find a way to help out Peter and be more effective without putting her life in danger or putting Peter's life in danger as well. But this procedure is what gave her super strength, it gave her super agility, and also the ability to cast bad luck on her attackers. And so now initially when she was approached, the main catch is that she didn't know that Kingpin was behind all of this. But once she did, she had then made a deal with Kingpin to work for him on certain jobs as a price she would pay for her powers, and in addition she wouldn't have to use them on Spider-Man. So like if he popped up, she could just opt out. But nonetheless, it was still devastating for her, finding out that ultimately she had shaken hands with the devil making this deal with Kingpin. And with the relationship between her and Peter having grown much stronger once he returned from Battle World, she really didn't want to risk at the time losing what they had by telling Peter what she had done. And that's why up to this point in time, she still hasn't told Peter yet. And that's the main reason why when Mysterio pops up here and he's just waving around the receipts like, ooh, I'm gonna tell your man what you did, which of course has Felicia bugging. But when Mysterio's like, okay, cool, well, you don't have to do it and I'll just tell him. And Felicia, of course, she feels as if she cannot let that happen, and as a result, she agrees to do it. And so now, Felicia, her plan of execution, goodness. Because when Peter gets home, Felicia is there waiting with the ultimate distraction right there in front of him. And Peter, being none the wiser, is just like, okay. And I gotta admit, like in my mind, I can't help but hear just the Wale and Tierra Thomas bad, like just playing in my mind when it comes to this. And so after putting Peter to sleep, she now has to act quick before his healing factor kicks in. And for the record, he's only knocked out because she had some chemicals in her lipstick that made him pass out. And so get your mind out the gutter, because that's all that happened. But having this brief moment, she uses the laser pen that Mysterio gave her, and she takes a sample of the symbiote. And for whatever reason, the symbiote just let it happen, and whatever that explanation may be, I'll just leave to your imagination. But so now when Felicia leaves from here to go meet with Mysterio, she hands him the sample of what they both believe to be just a piece of Spider-Man's new high-tech suit. And for Felicia, she's more so concerned about Mysterio just not leaking the information and the details of her past, which in this situation just causes her to act out of fear. But after this exchange is done, we find out that Peter was there the whole time, or at least long enough to see the transaction take place. We don't know if he heard everything. And so when Mysterio takes the sample to Jonathan Owen, they place it in containment, and in that containment it begins to expand and break out of the jar that he brought it in. And immediately Spider-Man arrives after following Mysterio back to Kingpin's lab. And man, I can't imagine how many of them bowls that Spider-Man them punched and cracked and broken. Like, Mysterio has to be running through those things. But so when Peter has this moment alone to get this piece of the symbiote back, he opens the containment, but it gets away, rather than just joining back with his symbiote. And it doesn't take long from this point for the security to make their way in, after hearing all the commotion from Spider-Man taking down Mysterio and Jonathan Owen. But strangely enough, when they arrive with the Kingpin, Spider-Man just gets out of there. And it's very much likely to him just being off his game and not wanting to engage in such a high-risk situation, at least not immediately. But during this time, Wilson Fisk does notice that they have some extra company, and that company being Mysterio. And Jonathan Owen immediately is like, I never seen that man in my life. And so now the Kingpin, just doing what the Kingpin does, he takes Mysterio into this nice cozy room to where it appears he wants to ask him a few questions nicely, or perhaps even not so nicely. But while Mysterio is chained to the chair, from the shadows in this room, the symbiote emerges and bonds with Mysterio, giving him the strength to bust out of his chains and emerge as the symbiote Mysterio, which is insane because this situation has escalated super quick. Like, if I was security, I'd have been creeping towards the back like, okay, that's what we doing. And regardless that even though at this point in time nobody really knows what a symbiote is, they haven't had the pleasure of meeting Venom or Carnage, like they really have no clue. But when this happens, Mysterio picks up Kingpin and pretty much uses him as a Kingpin, knocking down the other guards like bowling pins and making his way out. And Mysterio doesn't really waste much time with Wilson Fisk at this moment, mainly because his focus is on Spider-Man. And with him having just a taste of this power that Spider-Man has, he's now hell-bent on a mission to get the rest of this high-tech costume from Spider-Man to keep for himself. And so now, not long after, probably the next day or the next morning, Aunt May calls for Peter to meet up with her and have breakfast, and on his way to go meet with her, symbiote Mysterio pops up, catching Spider-Man off guard and likely making him miss his meeting with Aunt May, which was pretty important to Peter because at this point in time, him and Aunt May hadn't really been speaking, and this would have been the first time in a while for them to meet up and actually sort things out. But with Mysterio catching Peter here and attempting to remove his symbiote, we've just entered like a whole new ball game. And Felicia, who followed Peter here, she's beginning to see that the decision she made was a big mistake, because now Mysterio is much more of a formidable threat than he was before. But that'll do it for this one, guys. I gotta tell you, like, I'm really digging Symbiote Spider-Man. It's like these new and old mashups get very interesting when you mix them with old events. And I was also just thinking, like, just as an afterthought, that this whole narrative could also be like your new explanation to why Spider-Man's spider sense doesn't go off whenever Venom came around, which is just a possibility. Like, if this piece of this sample of the symbiote gets back to it, like the whole trait of deceiving Spider-Man's spider sense, it may have very well been a trick that the symbiote picked up from Mysterio. And it's even possible that the symbiote doesn't go back, because we also learned in Venom vs. Host that the Venom symbiote could at least communicate with its offspring and share memories without actually rebonding. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.